Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 1973, a story appeared in the New York Times, and I'm just going to read a little bit from it. It reads, "The Second Battle of Wounded Knee ended today. After 70 days, 2 deaths, numerous injuries, countless meetings, bureaucratic bickering, and a last-minute gunfight, more than 100 militants laid down their arms and surrendered this occupied reservation town to wary federal officials. The longest-lasting civil disorder in 200 years of U.S. history comes to an end after 2 Native activists lost their lives in the conflict, and a federal agent was shot and paralyzed." So that's how the New York Times reported on this moment, and this was, of course, the Wounded Knee occupation, a critical moment in the modern Native American rights struggle when activists seized and occupied that town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. 70 days of internal fighting with the police and local officials, tons of media attention and celebrities descending upon this town. So let's talk about Wounded Knee 1973. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
One place to start is just kind of to paint the visual picture, right? I mean, 1973, lots of reporting, lots of images still floating around, but, it is truly an occupation of a town. I mean, Wounded Knee, not a coincidence that they chose that spot because that was a resonant spot. But at this point, there's, a main street and there's buildings and so forth, and protesters occupied just kind of took over the entire town and holed up, and that's what sort of led to this this standoff over the course of 70 days.
It's a really remarkable scene, replete with people in traditional Native gear, with teepees going up across the town, and all of this being done in a very deliberate kind of way, like other movements in the 1960s and 1970s. The American Indian movement, which was what this was part of, was very savvy about press coverage and about optics when it came to their protest. And they were not only, we'll talk about the things that they were protesting, they were not only protesting contemporary discontents, but they were also recalling many of the long ago conflicts with the federal government and the wrongs that had been done to various tribes over the centuries.
I mean, for a long time, trust has just been broken between Native Americans and the federal government. You had the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, which a lot of people just saw as Indian termination, Indian assimilation, getting Native Americans to no longer speak their language, pushing them or marginalizing them off to reservations, stripping them of resources or the ability to create or generate wealth. And so these are compounding factors that have really been going on since the dawn of America, but really come to a boiling over point at this moment.
And sorry, just to point out the timeline there, you said, it's the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, right? We think of reservations and the Trail of Tears and relocation as being a sort of 19th century phenomenon, right? But this is in the 40s and 50s. There are laws on the books specifically designed at pushing Native Americans off reservations, hastening quote-unquote assimilation. And then as awareness and agency arises through, lots of civil rights movements in the 60s and 70s for Native Americans, there's these very specific set of laws that are being pushed back on in this moment.
I'm so glad you highlighted the timing of this, because I think for so many non-Indigenous Americans, they think the story of Native Americans basically It ends with something like in the 1880s, the Dawes Act, which is another attempt at assimilation, or maybe in 1924 when American Indians were granted citizenship. But the idea that this is a battle that continues on well into the 20th and even 21st century, I think is not really the way that this history is usually taught. That there was an ongoing war against reservations and against tribes going well into the 1950s and the 1960s that the American Indian movement is a response to. And I think what's important about this is not just that it's in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, but when the American Indian movement starts, it doesn't start on a reservation out west. It starts in Minneapolis, Minnesota, because there had already been so much relocation, so much destruction of these tribes that what American Indian life looked like by the late 1960s was very different than I think many people had imagined.
Oh, yeah. You think about the infamous boarding schools. I mean, that was happening all throughout the 20th century, where Native American children are basically being, shipped to other schools and assimilated into white American culture and forced to no longer speak their languages or forced to dress in a particular way or to cut their hair. So there's so much about this moment. I think I always think of it alongside like the long freedom struggle and civil rights movements and even women's movements, where all of these marginalized groups are sort of coming together in a very political way at the end of the 1960s, and a lot of things are coming to a head.
I think it's so important that we're sort of pitting this as a modern civil rights moment. Obviously, the choice of Wounded Knee, this location, harkens back to the 1890 Wounded Knee massacre, when almost 200 Lakota men are massacred. So clearly, there's obviously there's resonance there. The other thing that just kind of strikes me about this story, and is always the case and is important to kind of keep in mind, is that it is that mix of, there are internal struggles, there's external struggles, there's historical resonances. You get movements. Movements are just as much about kind of themselves as they are about the thing that they're fighting against. And so a lot of what precipitated this moment was also the fact that the tribal president at Pine Ridge was kind of seen as corrupt and cutting deals with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and negotiating land rights and so forth. And so you get that, you get that stew that leads to a tipping point. But that's clearly part of it.
Yeah, the tribal president, his name is Richard Wilson, was, as you said, corrupt, and he was undermining Native American sovereignty. He was taking land and allowing people to ranch on that land, allowing people to mine on that land. And he was not operating out of the good faith of the people. He operated sort of like a mob boss. I mean, he had like teams of men that acted sort of like goons that would enforce his policies, and anybody that tried to come up against them, would face his men. And it generated a lot of violence and a lot of resentment. And in a sort of twist of irony, it's almost as though Native Americans are looking to the federal government to stop, Wilson, to stop all of the corruption that's happening. And the federal government is sort of like, has its hands tied behind its back.
Right. And that it represented, I think, for many of the protesters, a continuity of the federal government's opposition to their interest and failure to help time and time and time again. So you have this internal issue with Dick Wilson. You have this sense that he is partnering up with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, so the federal government is on his side. At the same time, you have all these issues of nobody's investigating crimes, and particularly murders, on tribal lands. So here again, the government is not coming in to help. There's this sense of a sort of long-term failure to follow through on treaty obligations. And so all of that, the internal and the external, come together to lead to this kind of rallying cry for the federal government, both to help in this crisis and then also to provide more autonomy so that particularly these protesters can assert more self-government.
Yeah. We should say we've done an episode about the occupation of Alcatraz by AIM activists. That was in '69, I believe. There's a connection between these two very high-profile moments of occupation and lots of media attention. But that was an episode that's always stuck with me. Really fascinating when a group of activists took over Alcatraz. And just even on a tactical level, it's a little different to take over an island than it is to take over a town. Both, I would say, pros and cons. The island is a little maybe easier to occupy, but then you kind of run out of food pretty quick and the logistics get pretty tough. Whereas here, my sense of it is it very quickly just enters this standoff phase, right? And so the police basically cordon off the town after it's occupied. And for 71 days, there's a lot of cameras. There's a lot of celebrities visiting, which we can mention. There's a little bit of skirmishes here and there, but largely speaking, it's just kind of a standoff, and the days just kind of pass by.
Yeah, it's wild, though, to think that this becomes a huge media frenzy. I mean, Marlon Brando is there. We did an episode on this where Marlon Brando wins the Oscar and refuses it, and really uses that moment where Shasheen Littlefeather accepts the award on his behalf to draw attention to what is happening at Wounded Knee and other things throughout Hollywood that are extremely problematic. But Johnny Cash shows up, Angela Davis, Jane Fonda, Tom Wicker is there. The Congressional Black Caucus basically says, like, hey, we stand with you. So there's a lot of solidarity in some sense, but you still have opposition from the federal government, and you still have what is essentially this stalemate.
And not just a stalemate, but a siege, right? Because there are U.S. Marshals who have surrounded this town and aren't letting anyone in or out. So now you actually have, Jody, that island scenario where now they're in that town and they can't get food, and the federal government cuts off electricity, they cut off water. They're basically trying to starve or freeze the protesters, which begins to create a somewhat dire situation.
Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
One little thing on that Sacheen Littlefeather moment, which we did an episode about. She was going to talk specifically about Wounded Knee because that was in one of the Oscars there in February. That the occupation was already going on in '73 at that point. She didn't name check it specifically on stage. She talked mostly about Native representation in Hollywood, but I think everyone in the audience would know. And it was a high profile enough event that I think that was top of mind, and she'd talk about it backstage and so forth. But that's clearly part of this story as well. I don't want to diminish the suffering that was caused by the police response to this, but I also do think part of this story is clearly one of a level of attention, right? And we see that this gets. This gets tied to. There's quotes from people being like, "Wow, this is exactly like what we're seeing over in Vietnam," and people being cut off, and people, and like. So much of the story of Vietnam is that, like, for the first time, Americans were able to just see what was happening day to day and see something going really badly. And this is part of it, too. And I think the celebrity attention is part of that, right? And I think this is an era in which we really start to get a sense of, like, for good and bad, what it means for celebrities to take up a cause and show up in a way. And we've seen that, generation after generation.
But one of the things that the government does, I think, that really undermines these efforts is that not only are they cutting off, electricity and water supply in the dead of winter for South Dakota, February, it is still cold. But they're not allowing camera crews in and out. They're not allowing media in and out because they want to stop the media attention. So if they can't circulate images or pictures or video, then they can't keep it going. No. Or that's the hope.
Yeah. Well, and me and Niki as well. Like, we'll turn everything into a media story, but so much of this seems to be like, authority. Think about all the fronts that the government is sort of trying to control a narrative at this point, right? We have Wounded Knee, we have Watergate is spiraling out of control, we have the war in Vietnam, and so many of those are hinged upon trying to control information, being unable to control information, and so that's clearly part of this story. And yes, we should point out that Watergate sort of like bubbling up in the background of all of this certainly, at the very least, provided a distraction, I would say, for authorities.
Well, and competing for headlines as well, as the siege continues, that there's so much roiling the United States in 1973. We've done so many episodes on the 70s and how desperate they were at times and how wild they were. And this kind of fits into that. There's this upheaval that is happening and constantly on the front pages.
Yeah, I was also going to say, like, the disillusionment with the federal government as well. It comes on all fronts. From the war, from this certainly, but also Watergate. People have lost trust in elected officials. They've lost trust in the government to be able to, solve the country's problems. And daily, that disillusionment is getting, like, reinforced by these protests.
Right.
Such a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. But in that, or the kind of next step on that, I think, is a real understanding of how it is often connected, right? And this is an era, and I think we're living in another era in which people kind of, the disillusionment across the board causes people to realize that, like, the war in Vietnam is related to what's happening in Watergate, is related to the civil rights movement, is related to corruption, and et cetera, et cetera. And so you see that here, certainly, like, solidarity is the word I'm looking for, right? You see that in this story, for sure.
The interconnectedness of it all.
You want to talk about how this starts to turn, and we're hooking this to the end of the occupation. Are there specific moments along the way that lead towards early May, the occupation finally ending?
Well, when everything turns violent and deadly, that's when you start to see particularly members of the Oglala Lakota, who are the tribe that this occupation is coming out of. A tribe member, Buddy Lamont, dies. There are, as you mentioned at the top, Jody, there's a firefight, and 2 members of the Lakota Nation are killed, and then a U.S. Marshal is paralyzed. And that sense of we've got to find some way of ending this. There had been moments where there had been, like a federal agent smoking a peace pipe, and there had been a moment when it seemed like there was going to be a breakthrough or a ceasefire, and that fell apart. But after people start dying, that really is what pushes everyone to the negotiation table to bring things to an end.
Yeah.
But we should be clear, the standoff comes to an end, or the protest comes to an end, but Wilson is still in power. He's still the tribal president or chief, and he's still corrupt, and he's still, pushing his goons on people. There is still violence. At the time, these statistics just staggered me, because at the time, Detroit was seen as the murder capital of the world, and it had a rate of like 20.2 murders per 100,000 capita. But for the Oglala Lakota, it's 56.7, which is just incredible. The national average is 9.7, to give you some perspective. So the crime, the violence does not stop after this ends. Yeah.
So there were a few of the leaders of the protest who were indicted on charges related to this standoff. And ultimately that was dismissed. Apparently there was some prosecutorial misconduct. Not the first time that the federal government has messed something like that up. But one of these people, Russell Means, was a really interesting figure both inside the movement and outside the movement. So this is a big moment for him as an American Indian activist. He would go on to he runs for the Libertarian presidential nomination in 1987. He runs for governor of New Mexico in 2002. He had a lead role in Last of the Mohicans in 1992. So there's also like this this way that this fits into particular biographies of activism coming out of the American Indian movement.
Yeah, I'm glad we snuck that Last of the Mohicans IMDb nugget into this episode. But yeah, all right. Well, we will leave it there. But we've been wanting to get to this story for a while, so I'm glad we got to it. Thanks to everyone who has suggested it. You can keep your suggestions coming. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. But I say, as always, thank you to Nicole Hemmer.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson. Thanks to you.
My pleasure.